Alright folks, we've got some important work to do today, because it's time to pick the face of the franchise for the TI-99 4A. We're going to pick the game, and hopefully the character too, that represents the platform better than any other in TI-99 history. I've looked at plenty of iconic TI-99 classics on this channel, and I've talked about what makes them all so great. But once in a while doing that, I've gotten to thinking about who the TI-99's Mario, or Sonic, or Pitfall Harry really ought to be. I figure looking for a new face for the franchise makes sense at this point, given the last one really isn't much use anymore. As a Trekkie, I've always been jealous of Commodore landing Shatner, but even more so these days. Anyway, I think we can find a good replacement for the TI-99 from the best games for the system. So, today I'll decide who wins the battle when classic TI-99 games and characters face off, to see who's going to represent them as the symbol of the system. The winner's going to need popular appeal, and it should have an important place in TI-99 history too. Plus, it's going to need the looks and personality that make for a good video game mascot. I've got 14 candidates on hand, and we're going to see which of those games has what it takes to represent the TI-99 as the face of the platform going forward. My first candidate is Alpiner, the man, the myth, the mountain climber. A game that was one of the many highlights in 1982 for 99'ers. And I'd say this one is a pretty solid all-around candidate. The game's a TI original, so it has that going for it, and it was widely owned and widely enjoyed in the system's heyday. So it'll always have a pretty important place in TI-99 history. It's got big full-screen graphics and some pretty great synth, too. So I get the impression I wasn't the only TI kid who thought Alpiner was pretty darn cool. The game might not be a masterpiece of game design innovation, but it was a pretty popular cart in its time. And thanks to that huge character graphic and all the synth the game uses, the Alpiner's definitely got some personality going on for him. We get to hear him. We get a halfway decent look at the guy. And the manual even has a full-on drawing of him. Putting all of that together, the Alpiner makes for a pretty good mascot and face of the franchise, I'd say. But Alpiner isn't the only TI-99 game about mountain climbing, and it's pretty arguably not the best. So maybe there's an argument for Milton Bradley's Bigfoot getting a look here too. Unlike Alpiner, this is a really playable game that got as popular as it did really just by being as good as it is. It ended up being a pretty popular TI title in the end. But unlike Alpiner, it wasn't there for the heyday of the TI-99. It arrived in '84 after the TI-99 had already left the market. So, its place in TI-99 history definitely isn't on the same level as Alpiner's. Folks have come to love it in time, but it's more of a sleeper hit than an instant classic. Regardless, the question is, does Bigfoot the character make a good face of the franchise for the TI-99? Well, the manual art here too gives us a pretty great picture to work with, but in-game, there's not a lot to the character. He does roar occasionally, and rather weirdly. But that's about all the personality we get. So in the end, I don't think he can compete with the homegrown hero that Alpiner is. One interesting thing about Bigfoot is just how the monster, and not the hero, is the face of the game. So the question I end up asking is, who's the biggest monster to grace the face of a TI-99 game? The big bad who's good enough to represent the system? And I think maybe the answer is the Whompus. Hunt the Whompus is a game that got added to the library early, that sold widely, and that had a pretty unique design. So it landed itself in a prominent place in TI history in all those ways. And while it's not as widely played nowadays as the arcade action games the system eventually got, it's still pretty popular with fans as a nostalgic title that's just pretty different from everything else. Plus, as a character, the Whompus really leaves an impression. From the title screen, where we get a nice big picture of the monster, to those jaws filling the screen and those eyes looking back at you. And while the Whompus itself was an idea the game inherited, the visuals are the game's own invention. So the way I see it, the Whompus beats even the Alpiner as a TI icon. But next up, we're skipping way forward in TI-99 history to the present day, with Bouncy. The star of the game Bouncy, and the star of one of my all-time favorites, Bouncy's Obstacle Course. These games are certainly popular these days, but naturally they're only as popular as a TI-99 game of today can be. Which means Bouncy has a way smaller audience than a game like Hunt the Whompus did, back when the TI-99 was still in millions of homes. Still, for those of us who use a TI-99 today, Bouncy's a pretty popular guy. As far as the character goes, well, Bouncy's a ball. So when it comes to personality, there's not a whole lot going on here. But my take is, if Tribbles can be endearing, surely Bouncy can be too. Winning over an audience is just a little harder when you don't have a face. Bouncy's place in TI-99 history is a mix, given that, as a modern homebrew character, Bouncy's not in the origin story of the TI-99 at all. But while he wasn't around for the platform's heyday, he's pretty important today. And for me, that does put him ahead of a character like Bigfoot. Next up, in the search for TI-99 icons, we'd be pretty remiss if we left out Tombstone City, because this one was around for the TI-99 4A's first Christmas in 1981, and it's an original in-house TI design, so a true cornerstone of the TI gaming legacy. One of the other things that makes this one a classic is the release of the source code for it with TI's editor assembler. So it's not just a game people enjoyed playing, it's one people learned from, and in the long run, that definitely feeds into its popularity. It was originally called Saguaro City, after the saguaro cactus, but TI decided to release it as Tombstone City instead. Under either name though, for a system with Texas all over it, I figure this game's a pretty good thematic fit. The caveat being, I gather the saguaro cactus isn't actually native to Texas, and seemingly there are Texans who are kind of annoyed by its common but incorrect association with the state. As a Canadian, I definitely don't intend to wade into that battle, but I figure this particular cactus makes a pretty solid mascot for the TI-99 anyway, and so it's coming in at number 3 on our current list makes sense, just behind Alpiner. While we're on the cowboy theme though, I figure it's worth considering we've got other cowboy options on the TI-99, because one other in-house TI game with something to offer in the cowboy category is Slimoids. This one came out pretty late in the TI-99's life, so it doesn't have a role in early TI-99 history like Tombstone City does. But it's a really good looking game that plays really well. So in the long run it ended up as one of the more popular TI-99 first party games. The selling point here is that we've got a detailed cowboy character as our hero. And on the manual we've got some great art where he's featured too. So this is definitely the coolest look we've seen so far for a character in my books. Slimoids has some great colorful graphics, and it's the first game we've looked at since Alpiner that has a detailed human character on offer. But in the end, Slimoids ends up in 4th, because being a bit late to the party, it just doesn't make a big mark on the TI-99. One game that showed up right on time and made its mark in a big way is Tunnels of Doom. And I've dedicated a whole series to this game recently, since it's an absolute legend of the platform that played a huge role in TI gaming history. TOD came with 2 included adventures, but TI-99 community members ended up creating dozens more over the next decades. So TOD was the gift that kept on giving. And consequently, it's always been one of the most popular games on the system. What TOD kinda lacks, though, for present purposes, is an iconic character. It's a dungeon crawl. There's no character story here, and there isn't supposed to be. Still, the default party in Quest of the King have names, and almost every 99er knows them. So, Eric Seablade, it seems to me, is a pretty big TI-99 icon. Even if as far as looks go, he definitely isn't the handsomest hero on the system. For all the game's importance, Tunnels of Doom doesn't really have an iconic character, and for that reason, it ends up behind our frontrunners so far. If you're looking for a mascot, it's only natural to look for a good visual concept. But on the TI-99, we're looking at a system where voice synth is a core feature. So, a good voice could sell a character too, and our next contender is definitely doing that. The game is Sewer Mania, and Dave is our main character. Visually, there's not much to him, but vocally, he's got a lot of personality.
Got the bomb, boys. Quick, get it out.
Sewer Mania came out at the same time as Bigfoot in 1984 as a game for the MBX expansion system. So while it's really interesting as a game for a rare, weird add-on, the game came into TI-99 history late and quietly. Still, with folks who played it, Sewer Mania is pretty popular. And more folks have played it than have played just about any other MBX game except Bigfoot, since it doesn't actually require the MBX, so it's open to anybody. Sewer Mania will always be a niche title that most TI-99 users have never even heard of. But Dave's voice is a major selling point and makes him seem like more of a character.
Dave, find the bomb. Okay, boys.
Though that still just ties it with Bigfoot at the bottom of our current list. Alright, I've talked a lot about TI-99 games that I give credit for being unique to the TI-99. But some games that were absolutely huge for the system managed it even while cloning third-party hits. And TI-Invaders is one of those. I guess it's no surprise I think TI-Invaders is a top-tier TI-99 game. I've been using it as my standard background on my videos lately. But that's not just me. TI-Invaders got to the top tier of TI-99 games by giving TI-99 gamers what they wanted. And it did a great job of it. Which explains how it got as popular as it did as quickly as it did. And yes, it showed up at the right time, too. In 1981, just as the TI-99 4A hit store shelves. Which means it has an almost unequaled place in TI history, as one of the 4A's founding games. The look is good for a Space Invaders clone, but let's be honest, there's not a lot of point in trying to sell a Space Invaders clone as a visual and creative masterpiece. Still, the Invaders are varied enough that they stay interesting, which means they get top marks as visually iconic TI villains in my books. So this game is popular, it has a place in TI history, and there's enough variety to the enemies that you never get bored. And all of that puts TI-Invaders in the #1 spot in our list so far, ahead of Hunt the Whompus. One really important source of TI-99 exclusive action games during its short life was the arcade ports it got from SNK and Data East. And one of the most familiar of those is Munch Mobile from SNK. It's impossible to look at the art for this one and not see the potential for a great mascot. As a big-eyed anthropomorphic car who drives around grabbing goodies along the road, Munch Mobile has got a ton of personality going for him. And while the game delivers a cheerful, cartoony vibe, it is less technically impressive than you'd hope for from a late TI-99 game. The simple graphics and slow action have hurt its popularity in the long run, I think. It's well known, but not really well loved. Another thing that got in the way of Munch Mobile really making its mark on the TI-99 was just that it was a late release, arriving in early '84. So it missed out on the system's peak, and it missed out on a bigger place in TI-99 history. Still, you can't deny that a kooky cartoon car makes for a pretty good mascot. So while Munch Mobile can't compete with the biggest names in TI history and with better games, it's edging out a few of our contenders so far. Well, that's a lot of talk about munching, so I figure I ought to acknowledge one big name in TI history we haven't gotten to yet. Munchman, the little green guy running around a maze staying one step ahead of the who-knows. Yes, Munchman is a Pac-Man clone, but like TI-Invaders, it gave people what they wanted, just as a whole lot of people were getting their first TI-99 4A. Munchman was definitely bringing the right game at the right time to make a big mark on TI-99 video game history. As for the game itself, well, clone though it might be, the result is pretty damn good. TI mixed things up a bit to be a bit less blatant about the whole Pac-Man clone business. And Munchman's on a white background, consequently, instead of a black one. And he lays down chains, instead of eating dots. But the core gameplay is basically Pac-Man. And the most important thing is, it plays well. So it's no wonder Munchman was one of the most popular games on the platform in the TI-99's glory days. One upshot of those aesthetic changes is Munchman's got his own fun-looking feel that's not just Pac-Man with eye sockets thrown in. So, that new look does make it possible for me to see him as a face of the franchise. And I put him even ahead of TI-Invaders on our list so far. With the next game I'm interested in looking at here, we're again taking a break from in-house TI classics to look at what third parties did to create iconic games for the TI-99. And the iconic game here is Arcturus. This one's iconic for a whole bunch of reasons. It's a Zaxxon clone that came around after the TI-99 had already left the market, and it was developed by a teenager named Bill Bees from the Pittsburgh TI user group. What really makes this game a cult classic is that it managed to do something that Zaxxon's computer rights holder, Datasoft, said was impossible on the TI-99. So in the long run, that's made it pretty popular with 99ers, as proof of what the community itself could still do with this machine, even once the big vendors had passed it by. The upshot being that while it didn't have the audience that games from the TI-99's heyday did, it still had a pretty important place in TI-99 history. For 35 years, it was the only proper Zaxxon clone for TI-99. Thematically, this is a space game, so our main character is a spaceship. And the spaceship Arcturus definitely isn't going to be contending with the likes of Munch Mobile in the looks and personality department. But with everything else it achieves, it does edge out Munch Mobile in my list overall. If at this point you're saying, well yeah, but what about... Then fair enough, because yeah, parsec is definitely the missing piece in this list so far. A game that's the first one you'll hear mentioned just about any time TI-99 must-play games are discussed. Parsec's got everything going for it. Like Munchman, it showed up at the right time when the TI-99 4A was just arriving on the scene, and plenty of average users were looking for a killer app. And consequently, its popularity is pretty much unequaled. It uses the 99 4A's new bitmap mode for its graphics, and it does a few things you're just not going to get from any other TI game of its era. Smooth scrolling a background while animating sprites and playing both PSG sound effects and synth all at once.
4, 3, 2.
Parsec's place in TI gaming history is like that of nothing else I've looked at here. The only question for me is whether this spaceship parsec has the personality to be the ultimate TI-99 mascot. Great as the game is, you do get a more striking look out of the Slimoids cowboy or out of the Whompus than out of this little green spaceship. Regardless, Jim Dramus pretty much made TI-99 gaming what it is with this one, so I think parsec beats out even the mighty Munchman for the top spot on our list so far. There's just one more candidate I feel like we ought to look at, though. See, we've had a lot of villains make the list. So, maybe parsec is the winning game, but we still ought to look at the other spaceships on offer here before we come to any conclusions. Maybe the Binites are actually the coolest looking ship in this game. They're bigger than you, they can disappear at will. All I'm saying is there's some pretty cool visual style there for a mascot. And they're in the most important game in TI-99 gaming history. Plus, I'd say they're the most popular enemies in parsec, too. The asteroid field is exciting and all, but these guys are the big bads. Still, in the end, I think I've got to give it to the hero, and leave the Binites outside the very top tier. As cool as the Binites are, the little green spaceship that could is the star of the show, still standing at the top of our list. Munchman and the TI-Invaders are close competition, but the Starship Parsec is number one. Who do you think is number one in the TI-99 gaming mascot wars? Is Parsec, then Munchman, then TI-Invaders, a legit top three? Or are there other minor players that we should be considering here? Thanks for watching, folks. If you'd like to see my TI-99 gaming coverage in the future, hit subscribe. See you next time, and keep on partying like it's TI-99.